The air in the gymnasium hung thick with a nervous energy, a palpable tension that seemed to vibrate off the polished wooden floor. Mr. Davies, the principal, stood before the assembled students, his face a mask of controlled frustration. He gestured emphatically with his hands, his voice rising slightly above the murmurs that had begun to ripple through the crowd. Students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact, a collective discomfort settling over the room like a damp cloth. Sarah watched from the third row, trying to appear nonchalant, but a knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. She'd seen the way Mr. Davies had been acting all week, short-tempered, distracted, and unusually fixated on the security camera footage. It had seemed petty at first, a minor disruption. Now with this dramatic announcement, a sense of unease settled over her. Across the room, Michael was hunched over, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced with a rigid stillness. He hadn't moved since Mr. Davies began speaking, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his chair. Several students were staring at him, a quiet, apprehensive gaze that Sarah hadn't noticed before. It was a peculiar thing, this sudden scrutiny, this feeling of being watched. Mr. Davies continued his speech, his voice gaining volume in an increasingly urgent tone. He spoke about respect for authority, about the importance of maintaining order, about the potential consequences of actions. His words seemed to hang in the air, unanswered. Then, abruptly, he stopped. He looked around the gymnasium, his gaze lingering on each student in turn, before finally fixing it on Michael. One of you, confess now. The silence that followed Davies' outburst was thick enough to choke on. A few students shifted nervously, avoiding eye contact. Mrs. Henderson, the gym teacher, stepped forward, attempting to restore order. Principal Davies, she began, her voice carefully measured. Perhaps we could move on? Davies waved her off with a dismissive flick of his wrist. He paced the length of the gym, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, occasionally glancing at the rows of students. The fluorescent light seemed to hum with a nervous energy reflecting off the polished wooden floor. A student near the edge of the gym, a boy named Ben, let out a stifled cough, a clear signal of discomfort. Davies stopped pacing and pointed a finger directly at Michael. I want a response, he said, his voice low and controlled, yet laced with a barely concealed threat. Michael remained perfectly still, his face a mask of carefully constructed neutrality. It wasn't a defiant posture, not exactly, but a kind of frozen stillness that seemed to absorb all attention. Several students began to murmur amongst themselves, glances darting between Davies and Michael. A girl in the front row, Emily, subtly shifted her weight, her eyes wide. The air in the gym grew heavier, charged with a tension that escalated with each passing second. Davies took a step closer to Michael, his expression hardening. He reached out a hand as if to touch Michael's shoulder but stopped just short of contact. Don't insult my intelligence, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I've seen the footage. Michael didn't flinch. He remained utterly still, a statue carved from nervous energy. Davies took another step, closing the distance between them, and the murmur in the gym intensified, rising to a low, anxious hum. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, glancing around as if searching for an escape. Mrs. Henderson, her face a mask of concern, moved to place a hand on Davies' arm, but he pulled away sharply. Don't, he said, his voice tight. His eyes never left Michael's face. A bead of sweat trickled down Michael's temple, and he subtly wiped it away with the back of his hand. The movement, almost imperceptible, was enough. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Sarah felt a sharp prickle of unease, a sense that something profoundly unsettling was about to unfold. She noticed David, the school's star athlete, shift his weight, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his seat. Davies' gaze intensified, pinning Michael in place. He took a deep, deliberate breath, as if gathering himself for a pronouncement. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but instead, he simply gestured towards the large screen at the far end of the gym. A grainy image of the hallway outside the principal's office flickered to life, showing a sequence of events from the previous evening. It was a slow, agonizing replay of Michael carefully rearranging the principal's meticulously organized desk, replacing his pens with rubber chickens and meticulously stacking his stapler collection into a precarious tower. The image lingered for a long moment, amplifying the silence. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, broken only by the persistent flicker of the security footage. Davies' face remained unreadable, a mask of controlled fury. He didn't immediately address Michael. Instead, he pointed a thick finger at the screen, urging everyone's attention to remain focused on the looping image. Students shifted uneasily in their seats, some glancing nervously at Michael, who hadn't moved since the gesture. Mrs. Henderson, seated in the front row, subtly shook her head, a silent plea for Davies to reconsider. David, who had been a coiled spring of nervous energy, began to visibly deflate, his shoulders slumping. He avoided eye contact with everyone, focusing instead on tracing patterns on the worn linoleum with his shoe. A few students snickered quietly, a ripple of amusement spreading through the gym. Davies ignored them, his gaze locked on the screen, his hand hovering near the playback control. The repetition of the prank, the rubber chickens, the precarious stapler tower, seemed to burrow under everyone's skin. Sarah, sitting in a third row, felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She'd been so focused on Michael's stillness, on the unsettling intensity of Davies' scrutiny, that she hadn't registered the sheer absurdity of the image. It was childish, almost ridiculous, but the gravity of the situation, amplified by the relentless replay, was making it feel profoundly serious. Suddenly, a voice, high-pitched and hesitant, rose from the back of the gym. It was Emily Carter, a quiet girl who usually blended into the background. It's just a prank, she said, her voice barely audible. Heads turned. Davies's attention shifted momentarily, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. Continue, Miss Carter, he instructed, his voice regaining its sharp edge. Davies's sharp edge cut through the room, and Emily Carter, visibly flustered, continued. I mean, it was senior prank week. Everyone does it. Just silly. He gestured vaguely with his hand, encompassing the remnants of the rubber chickens and the now collapsed stapler tower. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the students, a fragile wave of relief washing over the gym. Mrs. Henderson, ever the pragmatist, stepped forward. Well, that's a relief, she stated, attempting a calming tone. Perhaps we can simply clean up this mess and move on. Michael remained motionless, his gaze fixed on a point just beyond Davies's shoulder. The principal's face tightened, a muscle twitching briefly in his jaw. He turned his attention back to the security camera footage, scrolling rapidly through the recorded events. David, who had been huddled near the basketball hoops, visibly relaxed, taking a deep breath. He glanced at Michael, then quickly looked away, a flush creeping up his neck. Sarah, who had been observing the exchange with a cautious intensity, approached Emily. She gently touched her arm, a silent gesture of support. Emily's shoulders slumped slightly, and she mumbled something about overreacting. Davies, seemingly interpreting Emily's words as a validation of his own concerns, addressed the entire room. It's crucial to understand that this wasn't a harmless prank, he declared, his voice amplified slightly by the gym's acoustics. The disruption of school operations, the deliberate targeting of personnel, these are serious matters. He paused, scanning the faces of his students, searching for a sign of understanding. Or perhaps, an admission. Davies continued, his face reddening slightly. We have a responsibility to maintain order, to respect authority. Miss Carter, I appreciate you acknowledging the gravity of the situation. But I want to be perfectly clear. The placement of those objects, the rubber chickens, the stapler tower, wasn't a harmless act of youthful exuberance. It was a calculated disruption, a deliberate attempt to undermine the administration. He gestured emphatically with his hands, nearly knocking over a stack of athletic equipment. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Michael remained utterly still. The muscle twitch in his jaw had intensified, becoming a subtle rhythmic spasm. He hadn't moved his head since Davies had begun his lecture, his dark eyes fixed on a point just above the principal's head, seemingly lost in an internal landscape. The silence in the gym was thick, broken only by the distant thud of a basketball. David, still visibly agitated, nervously adjusted his backpack straps. He avoided any direct eye contact with Michael, focusing instead on the worn linoleum floor. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple. Several students around him mirrored his nervous behavior, glancing around the room, sensing the palpable tension. Sarah, standing beside Emily, offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of Davies's point. Emily, however, was beginning to visibly shrink, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She mumbled something inaudible, her gaze darting around the room as if searching for an escape. The air in the gym felt heavy, charged with an unspoken anxiety. The rhythmic spasm in Michael's jaw intensified, a subtle tremor that seemed to vibrate through his entire body. Davies, visibly frustrated, took a step closer, his face flushed. Don't play coy with me, Michael, he said, his voice strained. This isn't a joke. This is a deliberate act of disrespect, a direct challenge to the authority of this school. He gestured towards the security monitor displaying the grainy footage of the stapler tower, the image flickering slightly with static. David shifted again, his backpack thudding against the wall. He picked at a loose thread on his jeans, his knuckles white. Across the room, a few students, mostly younger ones, had begun to whisper amongst themselves, their faces a mixture of apprehension and morbid curiosity. Sarah maintained her stance beside Emily, offering a steady gaze that seemed to convey a quiet understanding. Emily's movements became even more agitated. She pulled at her sleeve, her breathing shallow and rapid. She mumbled something unintelligible, her eyes flicking around the gym as if desperately searching for an exit. Davies cleared his throat loudly, attempting to regain control of the situation. Michael, he said, his voice deliberately measured. I want you to understand the gravity of your actions. You've disrupted the learning environment, you've harassed school staff, and you've subjected yourself to unnecessary scrutiny. I'm asking you, pleading with you, to simply tell me what was going through your mind. He paused, his eyes narrowed, studying Michael intently. Suddenly, a student in the bleachers, a girl named Chloe, let out a small, nervous giggle. It quickly died down, but the sound hung in the air, a tiny crack in the already strained silence. Michael's gaze remained fixed on a point just above Davy's head, unwavering. The muscle spasm in his jaw continued, a silent, insistent pulse. The giggle hadn't been directed at Michael, not explicitly. It seemed to bloom out of the tension itself, a reflexive response to the almost unbearable weight of Davies' presence. Davies shifted his weight, his face reddening further. He cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound that seemed amplified by the sudden quiet. Miss Carter? He began, his voice strained. Emily, already pale, visibly flinched. She mumbled something unintelligible, her fingers twisting the strap of her backpack. David, sitting beside her, subtly shifted his gaze away from Michael, his leg bouncing nervously. He reached into his own bag, pulling out a crumpled granola bar, and began to slowly, deliberately, unwrap it. The rustling of the wrapper was loud in the oppressive silence. Chloe, the girl who'd emitted the giggle, avoided eye contact, focusing on a patch of faded paint on the bleacher seat. Davies took another step forward, and Michael's jaw spasm intensified, the rhythmic muscle twitching with increased urgency. It wasn't a violent movement, but it was unsettlingly precise, a small, contained earthquake of tension radiating from Michael's face. Davies' hand moved, almost unconsciously, towards his pen, as if considering marking something down. A few students subtly edged away from the immediate vicinity of Michael, creating a small, hesitant space around him. Sarah, who had been diligently taking notes, paused, her pen hovering over her paper. She glanced at Michael, then quickly back at Davies, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Concern? Fear? It was difficult to tell. The air thickened with unspoken questions and a growing sense of unease. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the insistent rustle of David's granola wrapper. Davies took a step forward, his hand outstretched, as if to interrupt the sound, but he didn't. He simply watched Michael, his gaze unwavering, a subtle pressure radiating from his stance. Michael's jaw spasm had become a violent tic, his lips drawing back in a silent, involuntary snarl. Sweat beaded on his forehead and his breathing was shallow, rapid. Sarah closed her notebook, the sound abrupt in the strained atmosphere. She moved to stand beside Emily, who was now huddled slightly against the wall, her fingers twisting a loose thread on her sweater. Emily's mumbling had escalated into a near-constant stream of, "I don't know." It was a joke, delivered with a desperate quality. Across the room, Chloe continued to giggle, a small, high-pitched sound that seemed entirely inappropriate for the gravity of the scene. It was as if she couldn't process the intensity of the moment, finding a bizarre, unsettling release in the noise. David, sensing the shift in attention, accelerated his unwrapping, the granola bar now completely disassembled, the crumbs scattering across the floor. He avoided Davies' eyes, focusing solely on the task, but the leg bouncing had increased in tempo. Davies cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound. He turned his attention to Sarah, his voice carefully modulated. "Miss Thompson," he began, "can you tell me what you observed leading up to the incident?" He paused, letting the question hang in the air. Sarah hesitated, her gaze flickering between Michael and Davies. She began to speak, her words hesitant, almost apologetic. I saw some things," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I didn't realize it would escalate." Davies cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound. He turned his attention to Sarah, his voice carefully modulated. "Miss Thompson," he began, "can you tell me what you observed leading up to the incident?" He paused, letting the question hang in the air. Sarah hesitated, her gaze flickering between Michael and Davies. She began to speak, her words hesitant, almost apologetic. I saw some things," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I didn't realize it would escalate." A silence stretched, thick with unspoken accusations. Michael, who had been rigidly still, abruptly began to pace the small room, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. His jaw worked rhythmically, a subtle but noticeable tick. Davies didn't flinch, his gaze unwavering. Across the room, Emily Carter was a tightly wound spring, her fingers twisting a loose thread on her jeans with frantic energy. David, attempting to appear nonchalant, meticulously peeled the wrapper off his granola bar, the sound a sharp, insistent crackle in the quiet. Chloe continued to giggle, a high-pitched, unsettling sound that seemed to vibrate through the room. Davy shifted his weight, his eyes fixed on Michael. "Can you describe what you saw, Miss Thompson?" he asked, his tone neutral, yet holding a clear weight of expectation. Sarah swallowed hard, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. I saw Michael messing with the security cameras," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "Just adjusting the angles. He was doing it repeatedly and then he set off the sprinkler system." "And why, Miss Thompson, did you not report this?" Davies's voice was measured, devoid of accusation, but laced with a quiet authority. Sarah's face blushed, a blotchy red spreading across her cheeks. I was afraid," she stammered, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I didn't want to get involved. I thought it was just a prank." Davies nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "A prank that caused significant damage and disrupted the school's operations," he stated, his voice firm. He turned his attention to David, who was now meticulously folding and unfolding the granola bar wrapper.